Cleopatra is undoubtedly one of the most famous women in history, the Egyptian pharaoh, known for her beauty, intellect, and romantic affairs with the most significant men of her time. But what if I told you she wasn't Egyptian, likely wasn't as beautiful as depicted, and her relationships nearly brought down Rome? Today I'll tell you what your history books left out about Cleopatra, and let me warn you, it's more dramatic than a Kardashian reality show. If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe, and let's dive in. Cleopatra was born in Egypt around late 70 or early 69 before Christ, but she was from the Ptolemaic dynasty, which began ruling Egypt around 323 BC after Alexander the Great's death, when one of his generals, Ptolemy I, took over. So before Cleopatra, we have roughly 3 centuries and 10 generations of this dynasty. The Ptolemies were Macedonian, essentially Greeks of that era, and they spoke Greek. Cleopatra would be the first Ptolemaic ruler to speak Egyptian, as her predecessors used interpreters. They also had a tradition of sibling marriages, so her father was Ptolemy XII, Neos Dionysos, and her mother was his sister, Cleopatra V. At least that's most likely, since, while the mother's identity is certain in our laws, in ancient Egypt, things were a bit different. Some historians even believe Cleopatra might have been illegitimate. There's considerable confusion surrounding Cleopatra's ancestry, as our Cleopatra is Cleopatra VII, and her mother is Cleopatra V, who might also be Cleopatra VI. Additionally, Cleopatra had an older sister, Berenice IV, probably her sister, but she could also have been her aunt, due to historical disputes over whether she was the daughter or sister of Cleopatra's mother. This uncertainty clouds whether Cleopatra's official mother was truly her mother, and it doesn't help that Cleopatra V or VI disappears from records a few months after Cleopatra VII's birth. Moreover, Cleopatra's 3 younger siblings, sister Arsinoe IV and brothers Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, were born in the absence of Ptolemy XII's wife. You need the mother for that. I know all these names might be confusing, but hang tight. The characters will thin out soon. Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's father, was not a strong ruler. He was more interested in arts, especially music and alcohol. He considered himself an embodiment of the god Dionysus, often performing publicly, which people tolerated because he was the pharaoh, but he wasn't good at it. This weakness was exploited by Rome, threatening to annex Egypt. So, Ptolemy XII tried to bribe Roman officials with expensive gifts, but only ended up in massive debt, borrowing from Roman bankers. It became a vicious cycle. He even stayed silent about his brother's death, further eroding his already fragile trust with the people who were already frustrated with his poor economic policies. Eventually, he was exiled from Egypt, settling first on the outskirts of Rome, then in Ephesus, modern-day Turkey, with Cleopatra. His daughter Berenice ruled Egypt in his absence, trying to prevent his return to power, which, considering his ruling abilities, was smart. However, Roman financiers found Ptolemy's rule profitable, so a coup was organized in spring 55 BC, and he regained power, executing Berenice and her wealthy supporters, seizing their assets. Young cavalry officer Mark Antony was involved in this coup and supposedly became enamored with Cleopatra, then 14 years old. Ptolemy XII didn't enjoy his reclaimed rule for long, dying in March 51 BC of natural causes. In his will, he stated that Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII would rule together. This co-rule was challenging, as Cleopatra was 18 and Ptolemy XIII was 11. Facing famine due to drought and heavy debts from their father, along with Romans exploiting Egypt. From August, official documents listed Cleopatra as the sole ruler. She likely married her brother, following Ptolemaic practice, but refused to share power with an 11-year-old. Ptolemy XIII gathered support from influential people, aiming to reclaim power. Cleopatra tried to ally with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but he was only 8 or 9, making it a weak alliance. By autumn, Ptolemy XIII had the upper hand. Their conflict grew into a full-blown battle, with each having their own army. Cleopatra lost and fled with her younger sister. Julius Caesar tried to mediate between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, and Cleopatra, aware of Caesar's romantic inclinations towards noble women, decided to meet him personally. Despite her portrayal as a stunning beauty, we don't know how Cleopatra truly looked. Reports of her beauty stem mainly from Roman propaganda, painting her as a femme fatale. Hollywood films with Liz Taylor and others furthered this image. However, coins bearing her likeness show masculine features, like a prominent nose, possibly to emphasize her power and similarity to her father. Busts of her vary significantly, depending on how she wanted to be represented, so her true appearance remains uncertain. Greek writer Plutarch noted that Cleopatra's charm lay not in her looks but in her sweet voice and irresistible allure. She had a certain sex appeal and knew how to use it politically. She might have spoken up to 12 languages, including Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and Ethiopian, and was educated in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and chemistry, with a keen interest in poisons. She had a sharp mind and was adept at making strong first impressions. Historians differ on how Cleopatra first met Caesar. Plutarch and others claim she was smuggled into his palace, either rolled in a carpet or hidden in a linen sack, while other sources dispute this, suggesting they simply met without Ptolemy XIII's knowledge. When he found out, he was furious, feeling Cleopatra was conspiring with Rome behind his back, and declared her a traitor to Egypt. Caesar, however, continued trying to reconcile the siblings. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe sided with Ptolemy XIII, proclaiming herself the rightful queen of Egypt. Their forces besieged Caesar in Alexandria, where he was staying with Cleopatra, known to be his lover. The siege lasted until March 47 BC, when Caesar's reinforcements arrived, and Ptolemy XIII was defeated and drowned while fleeing. Arsinoe was exiled. Cleopatra, pregnant with Caesar's child, stayed in the palace throughout the conflict. Their son, Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar, or sometimes Ptolemy XV, was born on June 23, 47 BC. Caesar secured his dictatorship and stayed with Cleopatra, who gained Egypt through him. To avoid a fate like Berenice's, Caesar appointed Cleopatra's younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, as co-ruler and married Cleopatra to him. Caesar never formally acknowledged Caesarion as his son, but welcomed Cleopatra and their child to Rome as allies. Despite public hospitality, underlying tensions brewed. Caesar was 30 years older than Cleopatra, married to a Roman woman without sons, and openly involved with Cleopatra. Romans feared an Egyptian child might claim the Roman throne. Romans looked down on Egypt, seeing it as a decadent society. Caesar's placement of Cleopatra's golden statue in the temple of Venus Genitrix, revered as the mother of Romans, further angered them. To Romans, Cleopatra was an outsider. A group of senators assassinated Caesar in March 44 BC. Cleopatra stayed in Rome for weeks, hoping Caesarion would be recognized as Caesar's heir. But the will named his grandnephew Octavian instead. Cleopatra had no reason to stay and returned to Egypt, possibly pregnant with a second child, though this remains uncertain. She eliminated her brother-husband Ptolemy XIV and elevated Caesarion as company ruler. Cleopatra convinced Mark Antony to execute her exiled sister Arsinoe, securing her power. She met Mark Antony in Tarsus, modern-day Turkey. She arrived grandly on a golden barge with purple sails scented with perfume, impressing everyone, especially Antony. They began a political and romantic relationship, with Cleopatra needing Egypt's independence and Antony needing Egypt's resources. In autumn 41 BC, Antony visited Egypt and he and Cleopatra spent the winter together, enjoying games and costumes. The Egyptians welcomed him more warmly than Caesar. Antony, one of Rome's 3 most powerful men after Caesar's death, and Cleopatra formed a power couple. They had 3 children, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene in 40 BC, and Ptolemy Philadelphus in 36 BC. Before their 3rd child's birth, Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister. They had 2 daughters, Antonia the Elder and Antonia the Younger. This strained his relationship with Cleopatra, but they reconciled. Cleopatra's position in Egypt remained strong, despite threats from Herod, king of Judea. When Antony first saw his twins, they were 3, and it's unclear when he first met Ptolemy Philadelphus, but he and Cleopatra had big plans for their children. In 34 BC, when the children were 5 and 2, each became a king of their own territory. Alexander Helios of Armenia, Media and Parthia, Cleopatra Selene of Crete and Cyrenaica, and Ptolemy Philadelphus of Syria and Cilicia. Historians speculate Antony and Cleopatra might have married around this time. Octavia was still Antony's wife, but he was embroiled in propaganda wars with her brother Octavian, who portrayed Cleopatra as a sorceress who had bewitched Antony, comparing her to Helen of Troy, suggesting she would destroy their civilization, and that she was manipulating Mark Antony to her own ends. This marked the beginning of a major propaganda war, with Octavian seeking to undermine Antony's authority and credibility by portraying Cleopatra as a manipulative foreign queen and a threat to Rome itself. The political tension between Octavian and Mark Antony eventually erupted into open conflict. In 31 BCE, the 2 sides faced off in the famous Battle of Actium. Cleopatra and Antony's combined forces were no match for Octavian's superior military strategy and fleet. During the battle, Cleopatra's ships fled, and Antony followed, which led to their ultimate defeat. After the battle, Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. Octavian pursued them and laid siege to the city. Realizing that their situation was hopeless, Antony committed suicide, believing that Cleopatra had already done so. Cleopatra, however, was still alive and tried to negotiate with Octavian, possibly hoping to secure a future for her children. Despite her efforts, Octavian was determined to parade Cleopatra as a captive in his triumph in Rome. Faced with this humiliation, Cleopatra chose to take her own life. The method of her suicide remains a topic of debate among historians, with some accounts suggesting she used an ASP, a venomous snake, to poison herself, while others propose that she took a lethal dose of poison. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, the era of the Egyptian pharaohs came to an end. Egypt was annexed by Rome and became a Roman province. Cleopatra's children by Antony were taken to Rome. Her son Caesarion was executed by Octavian to eliminate any threat to his power, while her other children were spared and raised by Antony's Roman wife Octavia.